Berg. And I've known Hans for a long time. I remember this little redheaded kid when we first bought a home in Bemidji. And he's always a special, very likable guy. And one thing I found out about Hans, he loved the outdoors. His one grandfather especially was such an outdoorsman. And he has that passion too. And he loves to hunt and fish. But he loves the Lord. He was raised in a Christian home and has held on to that. He's a student at BSU, and a lot of us think of college students as not maybe having time for the Lord, but Hans does. And I'm sure he'll share and encourage us in the younger people's lives. You know, we're living in a time when we think a lot of the young people don't get it, but a lot do, and that's the remnant God promises to lead. And praise God for Christian homes that raise young people to respect God's word and to read it. But we all go, it's a journey of this life. But I'd like to ask Hans to come forward and share his story, his testimony, and what Christ is doing in this young life. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. My name is Hans Berg, and I'm very thankful for this opportunity to get to speak with you guys. I hope you can learn something from my life that'll help you out with yours. I'm going to share with you guys parts of my life and stuff that I've learned along the way. I'm blessed to have been able to experience many things throughout my life, and I'm excited to see where the future takes me. First off, I'd like to introduce myself to you guys. I was born here in Bemidji, Minnesota in 2003, so that makes me 20 years old. Just a couple of years younger than most of you guys. I'm on my third year of a bachelor's degree from Bemidji State University. My major is engineering technology with a minor in project management. When I'm not doing schoolwork, I enjoy many hobbies like hunting, fishing, camping, and overall anything outdoors like Glenn said. My testimony begins when I was very young. I was fortunate to be born into a Christian family where God is at the center of our lives. This meant that from a young age I was taught about God and who He is and what He has done for us. I've never doubted the existence of God in my lifetime, but this certainly doesn't mean that there weren't times in my life where I chose to ignore God's existence and do my own thing. I'm constantly missing the mark of excellence, as we all are. Thankfully, the God I know is a forgiving God that will correct my course. My life is full of course corrections from God, where He has steadily been teaching me what is beneficial and what I should avoid. I've also been taught these things from a young age from my parents. Like a parent should, I was taught to be respectful, saying please and thank you. I was taught to work hard, so I had something to be proud of. I was taught to clean up after myself, and all these things and many more were taught to me from a young age. The most impactful things I learned as a child were not the things I was told, but the things I saw my parents do. This taught me that if you want someone to act a certain way, you must first model that behavior yourself. I was blessed to be influenced by people who acted the way that they wanted me to act. My parents could have told me to work hard, but I wouldn't have listened if I didn't see my parents constantly working hard. The same was true for my faith. If my parents hadn't had a strong faith, they couldn't have showed me what a Christian was like. This is important for me to remember when trying to witness to other people that aren't Christians. I need to first check my faith before witnessing to others. This doesn't mean we need to be perfect, because that wouldn't be a true reflection of who a Christian is. Nobody is perfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for excellence. On a plane, they tell you to put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. This is the same when it comes to witnessing Christ or any other behavior that we want people to model. We need to first make sure that we are seeking to be filled up, to be effective at filling others up. This is one important thing that I can easily forget. I need to make sure I'm reading my Bible and praying daily to be a more effective Christian. Learning to model the behaviors I want others to have taught me another thing. It taught me to only take advice from people that are excelling in the area of the advice that they're giving me. For example, I wouldn't take advice about being healthy from an overweight person, or I wouldn't take advice about money from a guy who can't control his finances. This might seem simple, but it has been important for my life. And this is how I learned what being a Christian means. I watched people who I thought were good Christians, and I tried to model that behavior. This was helpful to me because I learned things like patience, thankfulness, and how to be loving. I learned all these things through Christians around me, but most importantly, I learned these things from reading the Bible. If I'm going to take advice from someone, there's no one more qualified than God. Reading the Bible has been very important to my life as a Christian, like it has for many. I'm thankful my parents showed me this from a young age. I wake up and see my dad reading his Bible every morning, and that showed me that if I wanted to grow my faith, I should do the same. I don't remember a specific moment where I chose to be a Christian. Since I was raised in a Christian family, that's just who I was. I do remember the journey of making my faith personal. There have been times of rapid growth, and there have been times of no growth. The times of rapid growth have been when I was consistently reading my Bible. There are also times when I was surrounded by more Christians. This makes sense because the times I was most exposed to God were the times I learned the most. The time I had the most exposure to God and other Christians was during a school I did and a missions trip I was able to go on. This trip is what has most influenced my life as a Christian. It helped me understand God's love for me in a way I never knew. It taught me many things like patience, resilience, and compassion. I was able to go on this missions trip through an organization called Youth with a Mission, or YWAM for short. YWAM's mission statement is know God and make him known. This is a very powerful mission statement as it makes our faith both personal and public. YWAM's primary way of living out this mission statement is through a school they call a discipleship training school, or a DTS for short. A DTS school is 6 months long, with the first 3 months as a schooling period with daily classes for their students to know God. The last 3 months are spent on a missions trip to make God known. This is the school I did through YWAM. There are over 600 locations to do a discipleship training school all over the world. The first 3 months of my school were in Cascade, Idaho. I chose this school because every other week they had their lectures out in the mountains of Idaho. At the beginning of the week, we would hike out into the mountains with our speaker. He would give us lectures on the trail. Since I enjoy being outdoors so much, I really liked this style of teaching. Every week we would have new topics such as the Old Testament and discipleship. I learned more about God and the Bible in these 3 months than I had for many years. Being in a Christian environment where everyone is focused on growing their faith was great for me. We were able to go into lots of detail with every topic that was taught. During this time, we also prayed about where we should go on the missions portion of our school. We didn't receive an answer from God until a few short weeks before we were supposed to leave the U.S. We felt like God wanted us to go to 3 different nations, which is not typical for these schools. We ended up going to India, Nepal, and Kyrgyzstan. All 3 of these countries are considered third world countries, meaning they are poor or developing nations. They all have high rates of poverty, economic and political instability, and high mortality rates. All 3 of these countries are inside what's called the 1040 window. The 1040 window is an area of land between 10 degrees north and 40 degrees north. The countries in this area are home to the majority of the world's unevangelized nations. These nations' religions are mostly Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist. This is also where the majority of unreached people groups are located. Unreached people groups is a term started by the Joshua Project. Unreached means that less than 2% are Christ following. Unreached people groups make up 41.9% of the world's population. This statistic is heartbreaking. The fact that 42% of the world's population are considered unreached means that we as Christians have a lot of work to do. There are over 1,300,000,000 unreached people in India alone. There is also a classification of people below unreached, which is frontier people groups. These people have less than 0.1% Christians. 3 out of 4 people in India live in a frontier people group. Almost everyone in an unreached people group has never heard the gospel of God. This is why missions trips in these countries is so important. We were blessed to be called out to help for a short time on the missions field in these countries. Once we had figured out that we would go, our team of 9 students and 5 staff would split into 2 teams. The team I was on would go to India, Nepal, and Kyrgyzstan, and the other team would go to India and Kyrgyzstan. Although a few people from both teams didn't have enough funds, God provided for them through donation and fundraising to be able to go. This is one common theme I've learned about God, is that if you're willing to follow his plan, he will always provide for you. There is no lack in the kingdom of God. It's like God has a checking account with an infinite balance. After God had provided all our funds for the trip, we were ready to leave the U.S. We were all slightly nervous, but excited for the adventure ahead of us. We hopped on our first flight from Seattle to Istanbul, and then from Istanbul to New Delhi. In total, we spent about 18 hours in flight to get from the U.S. to New Delhi. As soon as we stepped out of the airport, it felt like a totally different world. The smells of New Delhi were not the most pleasing, and the sounds of car horns and people was deafening. I remember the very first taxi we rode in and how crazy the driving was. It felt like we were going to get into an accident at any minute. The first day in India was spent getting used to the culture and getting over jet lag. We started our short ministry time in New Delhi by doing some street evangelizing and prayer walks, and praying over any temples that we saw. There are temples everywhere in India, and pictures of Hindu gods in most buildings and on the dashes of most cars. This was unfamiliar to us coming from the U.S., where we didn't see idol worship as blatant as in India. Everywhere we looked, we saw intense poverty and many people who were disfigured. It was a sad picture of what living in a third world country is really like. We spent about 5 days total in New Delhi doing street evangelism and prayer walks. When it was time to move on to our next location, we hopped on a 14-hour overnight train ride. After the train ride, we drove to the orphanage where we would be staying the next few weeks. This orphanage is run by native Christians. They have children ranging from babies to teenagers. This orphanage is truly a light in a dark place. The children they take in have gone through more hardship than many of us will go through in our whole lives. One specific girl, who was only around 6, was abandoned by her family, where she lived in a train station where she pickpocketed passerbys to afford food. She was born with drug addictions from her parents, and she had health problems from malnourishment. She was found by one of the workers at the orphanage and brought to the orphanage. She now gets schooling from the orphanage and Christian values from her teachers. Every child at the orphanage has their own story, but many are similar to that girl. They all were abandoned by their parents and forced to survive on their own. I was only able to hear stories of the children that survived living on the streets, but imagine how many were left to die by their parents. This is why the work at that orphanage in India is so special. They take kids in and give them a home with other children. The people that ran this orphanage had also been starting house churches in the surrounding area. In India, it's illegal to convert to Christianity, so house churches were the best tool to spread Christianity through the cities and villages. Another part of our ministry was going to these house churches and preaching with the help of a translator. These house churches were anywhere between 10 and 300 people. Every day of the week, we would pack 8 to 10 people in the orphanage's 8-seater minivan and drive 1 to 4 hours to a village or city to speak at a house church. We had to learn to think small because nothing in India is made to fit us big Americans. We often had to pack tightly in vehicles to travel anywhere. The first house church we went to was the most memorable. It was my first glimpse of Indians worshiping God in a nation full of devil worshippers. When we arrived at this village, it was full of mud and brick houses with no doors or windows. We ended up in a 3-sided brick house with a straw roof and an audience where most had never seen a white person before. It was commonly about 85% women and children at these house churches because the men had to work every day to support their families. Before we started speaking, they sang some Hindi worship music. Most of this music involves drums and lots of hand clapping. After the songs, it was common to pass around an offering plate like it is in the U.S. But unlike the U.S., every person, adults and children, always put money in the offering. I never once saw someone who didn't put money into the offering. This is something we can all learn from the people in India. They have much less than us, but are all giving money to the church. None of us have a valid excuse not to give up a portion of our money as an offering to God, whether it's to the church or different ministries or however you feel called. Seeing this put a challenge on my heart to be more generous with my money. I'm often very selfish when it comes to my possessions and my money. I can feel like I'm entitled to spend it on whatever I want because I earned it. I need to constantly remind myself that everything I have is God-given and that I'm blessed to have what I do. I should be generous with my offerings like the people in India are generous with theirs. These people have way less than me, yet I'm the one complaining about not having enough. Many of us here in America idolize our possessions. How many garages are packed so full that you can't even park a car in there? How many people are always getting bigger houses and garages so that they can buy more stuff? I'm not saying it's bad to have possessions, but it is bad when they become the focus of our lives. One of my goals is to try and live more humbly and not be consistently focused on buying more. I want to learn to be content with what I've been given. I want to live humbly so I can be more generous like these people we met in India. I didn't notice anyone at these house churches that didn't put money in the offering. None of them had much money, but they gave generously anyways. After the offering was passed at this house church, we gave our messages. It was exciting to be able to share what we learned from our 3 months of teaching in Idaho. The crowd to hear us speak was packed into this small house, sitting cross-legged on the floor. There was even too many to fit inside the house, so there were people outside and on the roof of the neighbors' houses that were all eager to hear God's good news. After the message at the house churches were given, our group from America was always invited to a meal. The meals were always some combination of chicken and rice. This was very generous of them to prepare food for us. What was even more generous was the serving sizes they gave us. They must have heard stories about how much we eat in America. They would heap rice and chicken onto our plates for us, and before we were done, they would be right there waiting to pile on more. We tried our best to politely refuse more than we could eat, but it rarely worked. We always ended up with bulging bellies because of the generosity of these people. The saddest part was that by them filling us up, it often meant that they would need to miss meals because they used up all their money and food on us. This was just another constant reminder to me of how generous the people in India were. They were willing to sacrifice for people they had never met before in their lives. There were so many different instances of this throughout our trip. It really made me think about my life and how I needed to become more selfless. After we were done at the house churches for the day, we would hop into the van and drive back to the orphanage. Every night at the orphanage, they would have some worship and we would give a short message. We would always play with the kids before and after. The kids at the orphanage never seemed to get tired. They were always cheerful and loved to play and dance. It was amazing to see how joyful they could be after growing up in such extreme conditions. We can all learn from this. We can all learn to not let our past determine our present. We all have things in our past that have been hard on us, some more than others, but letting that hardship control us is a choice. We can make the choice to be joyful today, no matter what has happened in the past. If these children in India can move on from their past, we should have no excuse. This is just another one of the many things I was taught by the people of India. During our time at this location in India, we had a routine schedule. We would go to house churches during the day and come back to the orphanage in the evening. When we weren't doing ministry, we were preparing for messages and sermons to give. It's crazy how much the believers in India would worship. There were enough house churches going on every day of the week to keep us busy. Once they made the choice to believe in God, it was a total life commitment for them. If they were going to risk their lives to convert to Christianity, they wanted to make the most of it. This is a very powerful picture of some of the natives choosing to be baptized. They chose to commit their lives to God, even though it was against the law. I was able to learn so much from my time in India, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to go there. The biggest thing I learned in India is to be thankful. Thankful for the endless blessings that are constantly given to me. My eyes were open to the reality of what I have compared to so many other people. While it's not sustainable to constantly compare yourself to others, it can be a helpful reality check when needed. Seeing a young man in India that is working 7 days a week, all day long, just to be able to afford to feed his family that night, or seeing a homeless, helpless child on the street begging us for enough money to buy one meal. An amount of money that takes us less than 1 minute to make in America. All these people are working so much harder than I ever will. Their days are filled with survival. Why do I deserve to have a mattress to sleep on when so many are sleeping on the ground? Or why do I deserve to not have to work every day of the week just to afford that night's food? The only thing that's separating me from poverty is the family I was born into. If I was born into a family living in a third world country, I'd be in the same place that they are. I'm not thankful enough to have been born in the greatest country in the world. I don't deserve to have as good of a life as I do. If we are going by the amount of work done, I should have a far worse life than everyone in India. I need to remember this when I'm feeling ungrateful for my life. I need to remember that I have an endless amount of things to be thankful for. God blesses me every day with things that I've done nothing to deserve. Once our time was up at the orphanage, we took a train ride back to New Delhi. This train ride was memorable because we learned something about one of the Indian pastors that we had been with the whole time. We learned that he used to be a main leader of an anti-government militia group in India. He had killed countless people and everyone knew his name. There was even a movie that was made about him. This explained why every government checkpoint we got stopped at would let us through with no hassle. They were all scared of him. Even with this horrible past, he accepted God into his life and was now a pastor. What made it even more crazy is that he has planted over 1,500 house churches in India. This is an amazing story of redemption and how God can use everyone, even the most broken people. After this train ride, we got on a plane that would take us to Nepal. Once we landed, we had a couple short days before we would leave for our next adventure. We'd be going on a trip to Everest Base Camp. We left Kathmandu to travel to where we would start our trek to the base camp. With our team and 3 Nepali Christians, we packed 9 people into a Jeep with our stuff strapped to the top. Then we drove about 4 hours to a small town where we were scheduled to fly to the start of the trail the next morning. The start of the trail is high up in the mountains, so flying is the most common way to get there. This flight is about 15 minutes long. When we arrived the next morning, we were told that our flight had been delayed because of bad weather. They hadn't been able to get any flights out for days because of the weather. This meant that there was a long waiting list of people that were before us. After waiting all day with no luck getting on an airplane, we were starting to lose hope that we would ever get to go on the trek. The next morning, we got to the airport early again, hoping to catch another plane. We waited another whole day without any luck. During this time, we were constantly praying for a flight and starting to accept the possibility of not being able to go. But finally, we did get an answer to our prayers in an unexpected way. On our way back from the airport, our guide happened to run into a local that owned a Jeep. After some negotiation, we found out that he was willing to give us a ride in his Jeep as far as he could, which was about 12 miles from the start of the trail. We strapped our backpacks to the top, and we drove another 11 hours in the Jeep through the Himalayas to where the roads ended and he couldn't go any farther. This was just one of the many examples of God providing for us, even through unexpected ways. Just another reminder to me that if you're willing to follow God's plans, He will always give you what you need when you need it. Even though it might not be the way you expect, God will provide. His plan might not be the most convenient thing, like how God provided for us an 11-hour Jeep ride in place of a 15-minute flight, but He knows what's best for us. We were very thankful to arrive at the start of the trail after a long, bumpy off-road adventure through the mountains and a 12-mile hike. Once we got to the start of the trail, it was game time. Our mission there was to give away Nepali Bibles and e-Bibles to the porters that were on the trail. A porter is someone who carries different supplies up the mountains. There are no roads or access for motor vehicles, so everything has to be carried up by people and animals. It's a very hard job, especially since they don't have any good equipment. The average weight of their load is around 90% of their body weight. They hold all the weight up with their heads. It's a terrible industry that has mostly been created by Westerners coming to climb the mountains. They get paid very little for the amount of work they do. Our goal was to give them Bibles and speak with them through our translators to help them know God. Nepal is located just north of India and is a very similar country to India. The most common religion is Hindu, but there are also many Buddhists. This meant that there were temples everywhere. This was especially true even in the mountains. In our time in the mountains, we saw many different temples and shrines that the natives worship. We might be tempted to think we are better than these areas because we don't have temples and shrines everywhere that people worship, but we have just as many things all around us that we worship. There's a quote that says, "You simply follow the trail of your time, your affection, your energy, your money, and your loyalty. At the end of the trail, you'll find a throne, and whatever or whomever is on that throne is what's of highest value to you. On that throne is what you worship." What do us Americans spend our time doing? For some, it's watching sports, or for others, it's their job. What's of highest value to you in your life right now? If the answer isn't God, then you should do some rethinking. The porters we met were worshiping many different Hindi gods, and our goal was to try and get some of them to hear what true religion is like. We had many Bibles that were translated into Hindi to give away, and since many of the porters couldn't read, we also had e-Bibles they could listen to. This time of our ministry was by far the most fun for me. It was exciting to be in the mountains after being cooped up in India. God wants us to enjoy our lives too, and we really enjoyed being in the mountains. We were able to enjoy the trail while also doing our ministry, which is what we came there to do. I've always been reminded of God's power through nature. It's impossible for me to be outside and not be blown away by the way everything in nature works together. From the mountain ranges down to the smallest animals, everything has its own place in the process. Everything in nature works together so perfectly. To think that it could all be created by a big bang requires more faith than believing in God. When we were in the mountains of Nepal, we were all amazed by its beauty. We sang a lot of worship songs and had lots of time while we hiked to pray and talk to God. We distributed our Bibles, and we hope that they are being read by the porters that are putting in massive amounts of work every day. Once we reached the top and came back down to the start, we were exhausted. In total, we hiked around 100 miles in the 13 days we were there. We were able to get a flight this time to bring us down instead of another Jeep ride. The airport we flew out of is labeled the world's most dangerous airport because of its steep runway. We survived the 15-minute flight and then got a Jeep back to Nepal's capital again. The next phase of our missions in Nepal was to stay at a church out in the jungles of Nepal and travel to villages to do house visits. We slept on the concrete floor of a church that had been started by some locals. When we arrived, we were told to keep the outside lights on so that the rhinos, tigers, and monkeys would stay away from the church. Better bring a flashlight if you want to use the outhouse at night. This was a rugged place where it was easy to get sick if you weren't careful. We all battled fevers and diseases that come with living in a tropical jungle. I was barely moving, sick in bed for 3 days with what we thought was dengue fever. One of the girls in our group was stung by a scorpion inside the church. Luckily, it was non-venomous. This time wasn't easy, but the rewards were worth it. We were able to see how some of the local villagers worship God in their own way. In an area with so much demonic presence, we saw how God was working through the people. Our daily routine was to do 2 to 4 house visits where we would speak to the villagers through a translator. Some were Christian, but many were not. They would share stuff about their personal lives, and we would share messages with them as well. This was a very personal style of ministry. We were able to speak with individual families and pray for them. We heard many awful stories about broken families and many stories about sicknesses and diseases. Many houses only had women living there because all the men were working in nearby countries to send money back to their family. Many of the houses we went to were in faraway villages in the jungle. Since they were so remote, they did not have much access to food and clean water. This meant that most of the people were malnourished and weak. Even though they all had little food, many houses we went to would still feed us. Just like in India, these people would sacrifice many meals worth of food just for us. They showed us what true generosity is like. We went there to try and teach them, but they taught us more. Once our time in Nepal was done, we got on a plane to fly to Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan is a nation that's mostly Muslim. Just like the other 2 countries, it's illegal to convert to Christianity. Our mission there was to support the local missionaries and help encourage them. We went to a few different church services and talked with some of the natives about their faith. Many of the Christians we met there were our age because the ministry we were helping was targeting young adults. Using a translator, we were able to hear their testimonies. Almost all the young adults there had been rejected from their families because of their beliefs. Being a Christian was socially unacceptable. In some cases, they were even beaten before being rejected by their family. This really puts a perspective on religion in the United States. We all are free to believe what we want. This is a privilege that many people don't have. When our time in Kyrgyzstan was over, it was time to fly back to the U.S. We were all excited to get back home after all that we experienced during our missions trip. Coming back home, we brought back lots of lessons that we learned from these countries. We were able to see the good and the bad parts of these nations. I'm eternally grateful to have a home in the U.S. that I can come back to. The people living in those countries can't just get on a plane to escape the struggles that they have. Before people in the U.S. can talk about how bad they think this country is, they should be required to spend a week in a third world country. Many people today will say things like, well, I would hate to be born in this generation, or they only focus on the negative stuff about the U.S. I would challenge those people to look at all the positives that we have going for us, like the free religion that we all have, and the medical technologies that we have today are ages ahead of what we had even 20 years ago. Life expectancies and quality of living are rising like we've never seen. We have so few actual problems related to surviving. I believe we have never lived in such great times. I would challenge you all to look for the positive and be thankful for the times that we're living in. But what's also real is that we do have many things we need to work on as a nation. But many people will just blame their problems on other people. Older people might say it's the younger generation's fault, and younger people might blame the older generation. Left-wingers will blame the right, and right-wingers will blame the left, and people will blame the government and the media. But in the end, the problems never stop by blaming others. I believe we all need to take personal responsibility for our own actions, especially all of us as men. Men were created to be leaders, yet we have a massive leadership problem. I'm challenging myself and all of you to take control of our lives so that we can be examples to other men out there. We all have things we know we need to work on, whether it's our relationships or health or finances or all the other things. We should all be committed to showing a good example and taking personal responsibility for our lives. It's a huge blessing to be able to be here with all of you guys that I know are doing that already and are leading this community with this prayer breakfast and other opportunities. If you think of all the good times that any country has seen, they are all created by relentless men. Men that enjoy challenges instead of running away. This is my goal for how I want to live my life. I'm not there yet, but someday soon I will be. Being a young guy in college, I get asked all the time what I want to do with my life. People expect me to know exactly what my life will look like and what job I want, but I truthfully have no idea. My goals are not related to what I want to be, but who I want to be. Who you are is more important than what you will do. What you will do will change, but who you are stays with you. If I become who I want to be, I can succeed in whatever I want to do. I personally want to be honest. I want to have integrity. I want to be humble. I want to be disciplined. I want to be generous like the people in India. I want to be healthy. I want to be confident. I want to have goals. I want to be a faithful Christian. I want to enjoy putting myself in challenging situations so that I can learn. Instead of focusing on what I do, my goal is to work towards being the best version of myself that I can be. And that should be a goal for all of us. I'm not yet to the level that I would like to be, and I hope I never reach that level because I always want to be setting the bar higher and higher. My goal is improvement and not perfection. This is how I want to live my life and how I want my future to be. How to do this is the next question. The answer is by pushing to outdo what you did yesterday. My favorite analogies are with weightlifting. If you want to gain muscle, you need to consistently lift heavier. Same is true for our lives. Whatever we want to succeed in, we need to create daily habits to get there. My goal is to constantly push myself and others to be better. And our goal as men should be to step up to the plate and be the leaders that we were made to be. And thanks for listening.